Super Castlevania IV and Castlevania Bloodlines, two of the most beloved vintage-style Castlevania games to ever come out. While many people hold Castlevania IV as being the best 16-bit Castlevania game, I argue that Bloodlines takes what its predecessor did and improves upon that formula to give us an even more refined Castlevania experience. How does Bloodlines manage this? Let's find out. The easiest way to understand the improvements Bloodlines makes is by directly comparing it to Castlevania IV. Castlevania IV was an early title for the SNES. It makes use of many features that the system would later be known for, such as Mode 7, scaling, and rotation. It's perhaps most famous for adding the 8-directional whipping and also gives the player more control over Simon mid-jump than in previous Castlevania entries. Aside from these changes, Castlevania IV sticks to the tried-and-true Castlevania formula the series is known for. Difficult, linear levels exploring Dracula's castle with a dark atmosphere and emphasis on platforming. Bloodlines was released 3 years after Castlevania IV on the competing Sega Genesis. Every trick in the book on Genesis programming was used in order to make this Castlevania entry compete with its predecessor on the superior hardware of the SNES. This results in a beautiful looking game filled to the brim with exciting set pieces and boss battles on top of boss battles on top of boss battles. Bloodlines takes a much more action-focused form than Castlevania IV did. While platforming still plays a role, the gameplay is much more focused on the combat, and this is where the improvements start to show. For some reason, people lose their goddamn minds over the 8-directional whipping in Castlevania IV. And I get it, it's cool, and how many times did you want to just be able to whip those damn birds out of the sky in the first Castlevania? But that's why there are sub-weapons. The whip isn't meant to be the only thing you use. Imagine if people made such a big fuss over Mega Man not being able to shoot diagonally. That would be ridiculous and defeat the purpose of collecting the Robot Master's weapons. Just like in Mega Man games, the sub-weapons exist to help you hit things that you can't reach with your standard attack. But it's not just that you can whip diagonally that throws the balance off. What really tips the scale is how freaking huge Simon is. He's massive! In the early days of the 16-bit era, developers wanted to show off how much bigger sprites could be on the new hardware, and this is to the detriment of Castlevania IV. You have so much more reach than you ever did in other Castlevania games. It doesn't make the game easier, it just makes it so that you don't need to rely as heavily on your sub-weapons as you did before. I mean, why would you ever use the throwing knife? And to make matters worse, the sub-weapons are pretty weak already. The whip just does so much more damage that it's almost always the more effective attack to resort to. Now, I haven't heard anyone else complain about this before, but I found it rather annoying that you can make the whip go limp. I mean, it's cool and definitely has its uses here and there, but I found it to be much more frustrating than anything. I can't tell you how many times I wanted to attack an enemy, but for one reason or another, the whip would go limp before the attack finished. The bottom line is, the 8-directional whip was cool, but not balanced properly. But the developers of Bloodlines saw this. I'd bet you that the people behind Bloodlines were big fans of Castlevania IV, but were able to see its issues and set out to balance them. First things first, rejoice all you diagonal whipping fanatics. It's back. But it's balanced. In Castlevania IV, you can whip anywhere in the goddamn world that you like, but Bloodlines puts restrictions on your attack. I should probably mention right now that Bloodlines has two different playable characters, John Morris and Eric Lecard, who control similarly, but have subtle differences that end up changing the way that the game is played. Morris is your standard Belmont substitute, wielding the legendary Vampire Killer. Now, while he can whip diagonally, he can only do so while airborne and only upwards. And this makes all the difference. Rather than eliminate an admittedly fun element of the game, that being a more useful whip, the developers balanced it. By limiting the time when the player can whip diagonally, the sub-weapons start to really matter again. Take this situation. In the beginning of Stage 3, harpies start swooping in to attack the player. You can't just whip diagonally at them, you gotta jump first. But the harpies are too close, and if you do that, you're gonna take damage. But you've got the axe. So what do? You use the sub-weapon. If you get hit in this situation, it is your fault. You can't always rely on the whip. It's strong, sure, but it's not always the right tool for every situation. But maybe you'd prefer to whip diagonally on the ground instead. Then you should take a look at Eric Lecard. Lecard is the opposite of Morris. Rather than only being able to attack diagonally while jumping, he can only attack diagonally while on the ground. He can even attack straight up in the air with his pike. This means the situation we were talking about earlier with the harpies is way easier as Lecard, because you can just hit them with the spear no problem. But that also means that other enemies are going to give Lecard a more difficult time than they would with Morris. Let's take a look at the Princess of Moss, the Stage 5 boss. She floats around ever so daintily in the sky, and as Morris, you can just wail on her. But as Lecard, it's hard to hit her because she's constantly moving and you have to stand still when you strike diagonally from the ground. It's doable, but not ideal. So what do? Hey, that's right, you throw the axe! Oh my god, it's so cool! So many different ways to play the same game. It's brilliant! We've hardly even begun. Now, as I said before, the sub-weapons in Castlevania IV aren't very useful. And don't get me wrong, they come in handy sometimes, but in Bloodlines, they make a world of a difference. There isn't a single level where you aren't at a disadvantage if you don't have a sub-weapon. They also take away some of the less useful sub-weapons. Gone are the knife and the stopwatch. Did I notice they were gone? No, not until I was writing the script. The axe, holy water, and boomerang cross, which is now a crystal boomerang, are the only sub-weapons. However, in place of the other two sub-weapons, we have item crashes. These special attacks use up more gems than normal, but give sub-weapons even more versatility. Each character also has a unique special sub-weapon that you get when you unlock the Fire Whip or Fire Spear. When you get the Fire Weapon, you have to be extremely careful not to take damage, as one hit and it's gone. However, the fire weapons are a lot stronger than your default attack, and you automatically get a special sub-weapon. Morris has a homing energy attack, and Lecard's kinda just blast the whole screen with projectiles. Here's a tip. Before you start the game, go to the options and set BGM to 5 and the sound effects to 73. This way, every time you collect the fire upgrade, the music changes to one of 3 classic Castlevania songs. I find this adds more tension and makes me try even harder to not get hit and lose the upgraded weapon. Attacking in general is improved in Bloodlines as well. While being able to flail your whip around is cool in Castlevania IV, I found that my whip would sometimes go limp when I held the attack button down too long or wasn't hitting the D-pad at the exact correct angle, resulting in less damage being dealt or me taking an unfair hit. But in Bloodlines, the opposite holds true. You can wail on enemies by mashing, sure, but if you're careful with your attacks and hold the button down, you can get an extra hit on enemies with a single crack of the whip, or spear as the case may be. This comes in really handy in later levels where enemies have a lot of health. There's a lot of nuances and subtleties about combat to learn for both Morris and Lecard, and it's surprising how differently they end up feeling despite having very minor changes to how they're controlled. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, the sprites are all much smaller than in Castlevania IV. This makes having a boomerang weapon that reaches across the screen a big advantage. It also means you're not such a big target, and I think that the character sprites look better in Bloodlines than Simon's does in Castlevania IV. Okay, maybe not while they're climbing stairs, I'll give you that one, but they still manage to have a lot of detail. I personally don't love the way Simon looks in Castlevania IV. He looks like he got a bad full-body sunburn, but Lecard and Morris both pop out on the screen and are much more maneuverable than big old Simon is, despite resorting back to the traditional hard-arced jumps. And this brings us to the level design. In Bloodlines, we go back to having a strict jump arc. Is this a problem? No, of course not. The game is built around this idea. While it could be annoying in the first Castlevania game at times, there's one key difference in Bloodlines that changes a lot. You can turn around while jumping. This is one of several features borrowed from the amazing Castlevania Rondo of Blood that came out in between Castlevania IV and Bloodlines on the PC Engine. This means if you need to attack an airborne enemy but don't want to jump into them, you can easily jump away from them but turn around mid-jump to land a hit, all the while sailing through at the same trajectory. Honestly, I don't think being able to control your jump arc in Castlevania IV is bad by any means. In fact, I think it's actually pretty nice, and was brought back in Castlevania Chronicles. Both Castlevania IV and Bloodlines do a good job of building levels around the jumping mechanics, but if you want to do a diagonal attack in Castlevania IV while Simon is airborne, he's also going to move to the side as you attack. I would personally rather have the ability to attack as I jump away from an enemy, but I understand why someone else may prefer to have more control over their mid-air trajectory. But man, so many of the jumps in Castlevania IV are really tight. A lot of the time it feels like you're only just barely able to make some of these jumps. I'm all for difficult platforming segments, but so many of these jumps involve instant death spikes. Why? It's just a waste of time. I missed this jump by a few pixels and I have to get sent back for that? Why can't they just deal damage? Sure, in Bloodlines there are a couple of bottomless pits, but there isn't a single obstacle that will instantly kill you if you touch it. It's not challenging to have insta-kill objects, it's just padding. And on top of that, there are a lot of stages in Castlevania IV that kill you if you fall back down. And I'm not talking about auto-scrolling levels or deliberate pitfalls, I'm talking vertical levels that kill you if you move the screen up too far. Why do these ever exist? Falling from a high place is punishment enough. Why do I need to lose the progress I've made collecting hearts and sub-weapons just because Simon lost track of where the floor is? I'm sorry, this is a stupid relic from Castlevania III that was only brought back because it was in earlier games. What's worse is that it's not even consistent. Some levels you can scroll the stage back down, but in others you can't. Every stage that has obstacles like this in Bloodlines is an auto-scroller, and the sense of urgency keeps you on your toes. The level clearly shows you beforehand that falling too low will result in player death, both by the automatic scrolling of the screen, and in the case of Stage 2, the rising, or sometimes falling, tides. But what really makes these kinds of levels frustrating in Castlevania IV is the way the stairs work. Yeah, I know, you can moonwalk, but while this is a cool trick, I found it to be much more of a hindrance than anything. It is way too easy to cling onto the stairs in Castlevania IV. If you so much as walk up to them, Simon will start climbing them. While good in theory, in practice this is a nightmare, especially on one of the later stages where it's literally just about climbing stairs. While this is handy and you can, usually, jump onto stairs, you cannot jump off. This sucks. This isn't in place to balance stair climbing or anything. The developers just didn't have the foresight to add the ability to jump off stairs. I mean, it had never been done in a Castlevania game, but there were so many instances where Simon clung onto the stairs near an edge of a platform I was trying to jump off of. Having the ability to jump onto and off of stairs in Bloodlines makes traversing levels with stairs so much more fun. Play a couple hours of Bloodlines and then go back to any Castlevania game that doesn't let you jump off of stairs and you'll know what I'm talking about. Not being limited by movement on the stairs makes the player feel like they have so much more control over their avatar, and I think that's a big reason why I prefer the controls of Bloodlines more than Castlevania IV. Instead of being a treacherous, annoying obstacle, stairs are just another way to get around, and you're just as mobile on them as you are on the ground. You can use stairs to your advantage as opposed to trying to get the heck off of them before some enemy comes after you. To go along with the new ability to whip diagonally, Castlevania IV also adds the ability to swing from special hooks occasionally placed over gaps in levels. While I think this is a cool idea, I don't think it's implemented very well. It's fun, but just like the stairs, you have very limited movement while you're swinging and it's easy to just get knocked down. On top of that, there isn't a lot of room for the player to experiment. Every time you see them, they're just to swing over a single gap. Not once do you have to Spider-Man your way across any long stretches of perilous doom. I think they were a good idea, just not implemented as well as they could have been. But in Bloodlines, things are changed up a bit. Pretty much the entire reason that Morris can whip diagonally while in the air is so that he can cling onto ceilings and swing. Yeah, that's right, he can swing on any ceiling he wants to. Oddly enough, he can't swing from these platforms that are literally just begging to be swung from, but what are you gonna do? If that was all that was changed, it would still be a great improvement on Castlevania IV, but it gets better. Morris is completely invincible as he swings from the ceiling, and his whole body becomes a hitbox. This means that rather than worrying about getting hit while you have to do some swinging puzzle, you can instead whip the ceiling whenever you want to bust through enemies. And of course there are classic jump over large gaps puzzles too, but there are also rewards you can get by using it in a clever manner. Now you may be asking, but how does Lacard use a spear to swing over gaps? Well, you see, he doesn't. There are a couple of instances in Bloodlines where a split path happens. One path is only accessible by Morris, and the other only by Lacard. Instead of being able to swing, Lacard instead has a super pole vault jump. Just like Morris, Lacard is invulnerable during his jump, and it can be used in a lot of clever ways to get past some of the trickier parts in the game. These extra abilities are so much better implemented because the player always has access to them, instead of only being used in select situations. The player is free to experiment and find new uses for these special moves as they play through the game. Another thing I wanted to touch on was the setting. Castlevania IV is a retelling of the original Castlevania, so obviously it takes place in Dracula's castle. Bloodlines starts off in Dracula's castle, but after that you're traveling all over Europe. This gave the designers much more freedom to come up with really interesting levels and set pieces, and my god, are there a lot of set pieces! Bloodlines has so many memorable locales and giant assets only used for specific locations. This makes every level much more memorable. Greece has the water and the giant statue head that falls. Italy has the winding Tower of Pisa and the first instance of a split path. Versailles has the chandelier room, and Woodman shows up for a hot sec. Each stage is entirely unique, and the enemies are unique too. While the Medusa heads show up in multiple levels, most of the enemies are unique to their own stage, giving the level its own identity. And any stage obstacle that can deal damage to the player instantly kills enemies, my favorite being the chandeliers that I just mentioned. I'm willing to bet that the designers of this stage played Castlevania IV and got to this part and said, why doesn't the chandelier hurt the enemy? And then promptly added in falling chandeliers that killed the armor knights in Versailles. Now, earlier I said that sub-weapons in Castlevania IV weren't very useful, and honestly, part of the reason for that is because they're also kinda scarce. I found myself without a sub-weapon for a lot of the game, and it's not like I wasn't whipping candles either. Whenever I had one that I actually wanted, aka just the boomerang cross, I'd accidentally swap it out for something awful like the knife or the throwing axe. Not being able to find sub-weapons or accidentally switching them out is a huge issue in Castlevania IV that Bloodlines solves easily. Sub-weapons are now only hidden behind specific candles, or rather, specific candle, singular. The single candlesticks will only ever hold a sub-weapon, and they're frequent enough that you will always be able to have one, but if you like the one that you have, all you have to do is avoid hitting single candles. It's almost perfect. The only thing I would have changed would be to add the item switching mechanic from Rondo of Blood, but even then it's not necessary, just convenient. I also found it annoying that you can't always whip candles that you're standing on top of in Castlevania IV. This isn't a problem in Bloodlines. If you whip while on top of a candle, it'll automatically break and you'll get the item. It's just a nice quality of life improvement. Now, as far as the music goes, there's definitely a lot of subjectivity involved. As you can probably guess, I've played a lot more Bloodlines than Castlevania IV, so I know its soundtrack better and obviously prefer it. But honestly, I don't remember most of the music in Castlevania IV. It's moody for sure, but the only songs that really stand out are the classic tunes from the previous games. Oh, and Simon's theme? Not gonna lie, that song is one of my favorite songs in all of Castlevania, and when it starts playing during the final boss battle, talk about hyping up the player. Aside from Simon's theme though, I think the music fits the atmosphere of the game, but isn't as memorable as previous games in the series. Bloodlines, on the other hand, does wonders with the Genesis sound chip. It's almost hard to believe that the sound is actually coming from a Genesis. Most of the soundtrack is almost entirely new songs, some of which would be picked up in future Castlevania games. I honestly think every track in Bloodlines is amazing, but the most notable songs for me are Reincarnated Soul from Stage 1, Iron Blue Intention from the Munitions Factory, Calling from Heaven from the final stage, and of course, the Genesis rendition of Simon's theme just before the battle with Dracula. No matter what console that song is playing on, it is always a winner in my book. Sorry. I do not like Castlevania IV. A blasphemous statement made worse by admitting that I actually prefer Castlevania The Adventure for the Game Boy. Bloodlines was the first Castlevania game that I ever played. I didn't have an NES or SNES growing up, so this was my first introduction to the series. I think that's also why I have a harder time appreciating Castlevania IV than other people do. That being said, I'm a huge fan of the original NES game. In fact, it's tied for my favorite Castlevania along with Bloodlines and Rondo of Blood. What made the original game so good is exactly what I think brings Castlevania IV down. Castlevania IV tries to emulate the feeling of the original game in almost every single way, even in the plot, but adds so much extra stuff that just doesn't fit into the same formula. Bloodlines takes what was innovative about Castlevania IV and presents it in a much more graceful manner. Bloodlines is different from your typical NES Castlevania game, and in fact didn't even share the Akumajo Dracula title the series had in Japan, instead being called Vampire Killer. While Bloodlines definitely draws influence from NES games that came before it, I feel that its main goal is to fix the issues that arose from the drastic changes to the Castlevania meta introduced in Super Castlevania IV. However, there's one major flaw in Bloodlines that I have not mentioned yet, and that is the lack of infinite continues. This makes for a very frustrating experience when trying to beat the game in one sitting. Although passwords certainly help with this matter, they're more of a workaround than a legitimate solution, since they also keep track of how many continues and lives the player has left. So if you make it to the final level with only one life on your last continue, you're gonna be seeing that password screen a lot. These days, this doesn't hold the game back too much, what with save states, and honestly, this is how I recommend one should play it. While I personally chose to play on original hardware, that's because it's what I grew up with. The Genesis Mini or Castlevania Collection for modern systems is really the way to go. The Anniversary Collection even includes Castlevania IV, so rather than believing everything I say, buy that collection and try both games out for yourself. You could even discover Castlevania The Adventure isn't as bad as everyone says. In a way, the 16-bit Castlevania games are kind of a beautiful mess of games, only connected to each other through their universe. They don't even share a main protagonist. Castlevania IV is the innovator, the first to come out, and flawed because of it, but lay the groundwork for future games. Bloodlines takes the ideas created in Castlevania IV and refines them, creating a more balanced experience. And then, there's Rondo of Blood, but we'll have to save that one for another day. I'm Bofner, and thanks for watching. See ya! Oh my god, he took his head off.
Wow, that's such a cool attack.
I didn't know he did
He only
that.
hits it once, too.